A frigid wind swept over the sprawling courtyard of the Red Keep as Eddard Stark made his way through the castle's inner ward, boots echoing on the stone ground. Servants and guards bowed respectfully or stepped out of his way, for they had come to know and respect the quiet northerner who served as hand of the king. Over the past weeks, Eddard had grown accustomed to the constant bustle of King's Landing, but he would never truly be comfortable here. The stench of secrets and the clamor of too many people in cramped, dirty streets made him long for the wide, open spaces of Winterfell. He had been summoned to meet the king in his private chambers, where something apparently delicate awaited his attention. Ned, as was his custom, tried to quash the tension in his gut by focusing on the soldier's discipline he had cultivated his entire life. When he entered the chamber, Robert Baratheon stood by the window. The king's massive frame blocked much of the light that shone through the high, narrow opening. Robert was in a somber mood, his face set into lines of worry that were far too deep and too old for a man who once laughed with the abandon of a boy. A table stood to the left of the room, covered in half-empty cups of wine and remnants of untouched bread. The king gestured to Ned to close the door. "You came quickly," Robert said, nodding in half-appreciation. "Good. I needed to see you alone. You know I wouldn't trouble you with trivialities." Ned inclined his head. "Of course, Your Grace. I hope all is well," Robert exhaled. "As well as it can be, I suppose." For a moment, the big man looked uncertain, nearly shy, his massive arms dropping to his sides in a gesture of disquiet. "I have someone to show you." Behind Robert stood a young boy who had gone unnoticed until that moment. His hair was dark, thick, and straight, and his blue eyes blazed even in the dim light. At first glance, Ned felt a jolt of recognition. The boy's features, though not identical, reminded him of a face he had seen 1,000 times. King Robert's face. Ned did not need any more explanation. He knew at once that this child was the king's bastard. For a moment, an image of the late Jon Arryn flickered in Ned's mind. The old man's final words about Robert's bastards, about how important they were in some terrible puzzle of truth that had ultimately cost Jon his life. "This is Gendry," Robert said, sounding forced, as though the name had stuck to his tongue. "He's my son." The boy appeared wary. His hands balled at his sides, and he stole glances up at Robert with a mixture of awe and fear. Gendry was big-boned for his age, perhaps around 10 or 11, and if he was this broad-shouldered already, Ned thought he would grow into a formidable man. Robert gave an awkward cough. "He's been working in the city, an apprentice to some armorer. The mother was... well, it doesn't matter." His voice took on that old bitterness. "But I cannot leave him there unprotected. The Lannisters..." He stopped, anger tightening his voice. "I won't have him butchered or manipulated into someone's game. Ned. He's my blood." Ned kept his voice level, though inside he felt a tug of sympathy for the child. "Aye, Your Grace." Robert cleared his throat again. "The realm knows I have bastards here and there. It's no secret. But this one, Jon Arryn knew he existed, and so did others. Word might spread. Cersei, Tywin. They wouldn't hesitate to do what needs doing to keep their hold on the throne unchallenged. And if it's discovered I have a recognized bastard in King's Landing, who knows what they might do to him to seal alliances or to ensure no threats arise to Joffrey's claim." He spat the name like a foul taste. "I won't have it." Ned studied Robert's face. The king did not appear to expect an argument. He simply looked at Ned with an earnestness that was rare in court. "What is it you would have me do?" Robert set a huge hand on Gendry's shoulder, a gesture that was almost gentle. "If you would, I'd have you take him north, as your ward. I know it's unusual. He's not a highborn by law, though the blood in his veins is mine. If he's raised in Winterfell, he'll be safe from the vipers in the south. And I know you, Ned. You'll treat him fairly. You'll teach him honor." Ned's breath slowed. The request was monumental in ways Robert might not even realize. To take in a bastard child of the king as his ward would be more than an act of simple guardianship. It might spark whispers, illusions of a Baratheon, Stark alliance that would overshadow any other arrangement. And if Gendry discovered his heritage, or if others forced it upon him, the political ramifications could be severe. Already, Ned could hear the unspoken. Such an alliance might kindle talk of Gendry one day becoming legitimized, or forging a bond with House Stark. He saw the gravity in Robert's eyes. His old friend was not as ignorant of political maneuvers as people believed. He was protecting Gendry, yes, but also forging a potential bulwark against the Lannisters. Robert wanted Ned on his side, bound more tightly than ever. Slowly, Ned nodded. "I will take him, if that is your wish, your grace." He looked at Gendry, reading fear and curiosity in the boy's gaze. "He will be treated with the respect and care due any ward in my household. If I have your leave, I would depart with him soon. The boy does not belong in the south, not if you truly wish him to be safe." Relief lit Robert's face. "Yes, Ned, take him and keep him safe. Teach him the ways of the north. Teach him to swing a sword, and keep him out of the gods-damned court, away from Cersei's eyes." The king's voice faltered for a moment. "You were always like a brother to me. You know I love you for this." Ned's nod was a touch more formal than usual, though he offered a faint smile to cushion it. "Of course, Robert." He looked to the child. "Gendry, do you want to come north with me?" The boy's eyes flickered back and forth between the king and Ned. He swallowed hard. His voice was uncertain but not weak. I do, my lord." Robert ruffled the boy's dark hair. Then it settled. He eyed Ned carefully, as if measuring how this single decision might spin the web of alliances. "I'll send you off with provisions and the best guards to see you as far as the neck. But once you pass Moat Cailin, I doubt you'll need them." Ned inclined his head again. "We'll need to leave soon, perhaps in a few days. The journey is long, and I'd like to be home before the snows thicken." "Go as soon as you see fit," Robert said. "Just make sure the boy doesn't breathe a word to anyone about who he is." He gave Gendry a stern look. "Not a word. You're no Baratheon at court. You're just my ward's ward." Gendry's eyes flashed as if he did not fully comprehend, but he nodded quickly enough to appease the king. Ned felt a quiet compassion for the lad. So young, forced into a game he could not yet understand. But that was the way of kings, bastards, and the Iron Throne. Standing in that quiet room in the Red Keep, Ned realized that from this day onward, something crucial had changed. Fate had shifted course. They left King's Landing at first light a week later. The retinue that followed Ned out of the capital was smaller than the one he had arrived with, as Ned preferred to travel lightly when possible. He rode at the head, with Gendry on a sturdy northern Garron at his side. 2 Stark men-at-arms rode behind, and a few knights and squires from King Robert's personal guard trailed behind them, their banners hidden on the king's orders. They were to blend in as much as possible, without calling attention to the fact that among them rode a boy with the blood of Baratheon kings. The early days of the journey were humid and dusty, and Gendry seemed overwhelmed, though he concealed it with a stoicism that struck Ned as curiously reminiscent of a true Northman. The boy asked few questions, but at night, when they made camp by a stream or under a stand of willow trees, Ned would sit with him, offering him a slice of bread, a piece of roasted fish or hare, trying to get the measure of him. Gendry was polite, well-spoken in a blunt, unrefined way, though he had more of a street urchin's directness than the practiced courtesy of a high-born youth. "Is it cold in the north all the time?" Gendry asked one evening when the sun's pinkish glow lit the horizon. "Not all the time," Ned replied, turning the roasted hare on the spit. "Summer can be quite pleasant, even hot. But yes, it is usually colder than the south. Winterfell has hot springs that keep the castle warm. You'll not be freezing beneath our roofs." "Never lived in a castle before," Gendry said, almost in wonder. He tore a small chunk of bread and chewed thoughtfully. "I lived in Flea Bottom with my mother until I was old enough to apprentice. Then I slept in the shop." Ned didn't pry into the mother's identity. If Robert had not cared to reveal the details, Ned saw no reason to wound the boy with old stories. "You'll find Winterfell different. You'll have new duties. You'll learn to fight, read, write, hunt, and forge your own path in the north." Gendry's eyes brightened at the mention of fighting. "I know a bit of swordplay. The boys in the streets like to scrap." Ned hid a small smile. "You'll learn proper techniques. No more scrapping in the mud." A hint of a grin tugged at Gendry's lips. He seemed to see Ned for the first time in a different light, not just as a lord but as a man who held a form of fatherly authority. Ned did not wish to replace Robert Baratheon in the boy's mind, nor could he, but he felt the first stirrings of what it meant to guide someone so unexpectedly placed in his care. The days became weeks. The King's Guard peeled away after escorting them safely out of the Crownlands, leaving Ned and his men free to continue north without ostentation. They kept to well-traveled roads, passing farmland and hamlets where peasants bowed their heads to the Stark sigil. Gendry soon learned how to groom his horse, set up a tent, and care for his belongings in the disciplined manner Ned demanded of anyone under his watch. Despite the fatigue of travel, Gendry's spirit seemed to rise. He took pride in helping gather kindling and digging fire pits. One afternoon, when some wolves prowled near their camp, Gendry showed no fear, merely watching the animals with the same curiosity they showed him. Ned marked that moment, thinking again of the boy's possible future. Perhaps there was something of the wolf as well as the stag in him. When at last they reached Moat Cailin and saw the ruined towers rising from the bog, Ned felt relief, even if the place was as dreary as always. The marshland was overrun with biting insects, and the ancient stronghold that once guarded the neck looked forlorn. But here was the edge of the north, and from here on, the land was Ned's domain. Gendry, for his part, gazed on the half-sunken towers in awe, as though they were living legends. Ned wished he could show the boy these parts of the north without the gloom that lay over them. But that was the nature of the place. Ancient, battered, proud even in ruin. They rode past the neck, crossing swamplands and causeways, and then the countryside began to change. More fir trees appeared, the air turned chill, and autumn leaves fluttered in pockets of woodland. The sky widened, overshadowed less by the weight of southern humidity. Here in the north, Gendry looked around with wide eyes, enthralled by the crisp, stark beauty of it all. Finally, one late afternoon, they topped a low rise and saw Winterfell in the distance. Ned always felt a surge of warmth upon that first glimpse of his home. The granite walls stood solid against the horizon, the watchtowers rising above them, and surrounding farmland glistened with the last gold of autumn. Smoke curled from the chimneys. Even from afar, Ned could sense the presence of the hot springs that warmed the castle's walls and glass gardens. A deep nostalgia took hold of him, along with relief. He was home. Gendry stared, saying nothing at first. Then, in a soft voice, "It's huge," he murmured. "Bigger than the Red Keep?" He sounded uncertain, as though not trusting his own comparison. "Not quite," Ned told him gently, "but it's large enough, and it's yours now. Come." They rode forward. Word had been sent ahead, so the gate guards welcomed them with smiles and raised fists. The courtyard bustled with stable boys and servants eager to take the horses. Ned dismounted and was quickly greeted by Maester Luwin, a slight man whose gray robes rippled in the breeze. "Lord Stark," Luwin greeted, bowing slightly. "Welcome back, my lord. And welcome," he added, turning to Gendry with a kind smile, "to Winterfell." Gendry slid off his horse, awkward and stiff from so many days riding. He looked around, trying to take in everything at once. The stables, the stone towers, the yard where men practiced archery on straw targets. His gaze caught on a group of children standing at the edge of the courtyard. Robb Stark, tall for his 15 years, stood next to Sansa, Arya, and little Bran. Next to them, Theon Greyjoy, the ward of Ned Stark, loitered with casual arrogance, arms crossed. Rickon was only 4, so he was likely inside somewhere else, or in the care of old Nan. Robb was the first to step forward, as was proper for the heir of Winterfell. "Father," he greeted Ned, a wide smile on his face. "Welcome home." His eyes flitted curiously to Gendry. "You brought someone with you?" Ned set a hand gently on Gendry's shoulder. "This is Gendry. He'll be our ward from this day on. He's come a long way, so let us show him a warm welcome." He cast a firm glance around at the children. He knew each child's temperament, but it was important for them to treat this new arrival with courtesy. "Where is your lady mother?" "She's inside with Rickon," Sansa said, curtsying politely. She examined Gendry with a mixture of curiosity and mild dismay at his rough attire. But being the dutiful young lady she was, she smiled. "Welcome to Winterfell." Arya, on the other hand, was openly inquisitive, edging closer, looking Gendry up and down as though trying to decipher if he might be a friend or foe. "How old are you?" she asked bluntly. 11, Gendry answered. Uncertain whether he needed to address her as "my lady," he decided on caution. "My lady," he added. Arya's face scrunched with the hint of a scowl. "Don't call me that." Maester Luwin cleared his throat diplomatically. "We've prepared a room for him in the guest wing, Lord Stark, if that pleases you. It adjoins Theon's and is near the library tower." "That will do," Ned said. He turned to Gendry. "You'll have a chance to rest and wash. Later we'll talk about your duties." Gendry nodded, still overwhelmed. A stable boy stepped up to take his horse, and the boy hesitated before handing off the reins. He followed Luwin, glancing over his shoulder at the Stark children, who watched him with open curiosity. This was to be his new home, and he was not entirely sure how to feel about it. The next days rolled by in a whirlwind of introductions and adjustments. Ned presented Gendry formally to Lady Catelyn Stark. The Lady of Winterfell was gracious but reserved. Ned could sense her discomfort. She did not say anything directly about Gendry's parentage, but Ned knew she suspected who the boy truly was. She was polite and hospitable, making sure Gendry had suitable clothing and enough to eat. Yet she watched him with a careful eye, as if uncertain what might come of this newest addition to their household. Jon Snow, Ned's own acknowledged bastard, was away at the Wall by this point in time. His departure had occurred before Ned left for King's Landing. Sometimes Ned wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. Jon and Gendry might have found common ground in their status, or it might have complicated their separate journeys. In any case, Ned had no choice now but to see Gendry properly integrated. First, the boy kept to himself. He was unaccustomed to the formality of Winterfell's meals, the calling of the watch every evening, and the presence of noble-born youths who lived in the castle. Robb tried to include him in sword practice. Gendry took to it with genuine eagerness, swinging the wooden practice sword with surprising strength for his age. Theon teased him about his blacksmith arms, but Gendry did not rise to the bait. He simply poured all his energy into training. Before long, it was evident that Gendry had a natural prowess that, once honed, might make him formidable. The Master-at-Arms, Ser Roderick Castle, praised the boy's raw power while also warning him that there was far more to a fight than brute force. The hours not spent in arms training were filled with lessons from Maester Luwin, history, reading, writing, the geography of the Seven Kingdoms. Gendry stumbled over reading aloud but threw himself into learning about blacksmithing. He peppered Luwin with questions about metals, forging, and the North's resources. He also spent time in Winterfell's own smithy, where Mikken worked, eager to handle the tools and watch the older man's technique. Mikken allowed him to perform small tasks, like helping shape nails or hinges, and Gendry did so with an enthusiasm that put a small grin on Mikken's face. The boy was not friendless, for the Stark children treated him kindly enough, though some with more warmth than others. Robb was polite, but there was always that slight, intangible distance. Robb was the heir, used to a certain station, and Gendry was still trying to find his place. Sansa, being only slightly younger than Robb, had little to do with Gendry. She was preoccupied with her lady's lessons, needlework, and daydreams of knights and gallant stories. Arya, however, was drawn to Gendry's fierceness. She saw in him something akin to her own rebellious spirit, and though she was younger, she had a knack for talking to him. At first, he found her forwardness off-putting, but her curiosity about swords and bows appealed to him. They would sometimes talk about the times Gendry had played with wooden swords in Flea Bottom. Arya, in turn, told him about how she disliked wearing dresses and how she wanted to learn archery like her brothers. Their friendship was not close instantly, but a mutual respect began to form. Theon Greyjoy, on the other hand, wavered between condescension and camaraderie. He liked having someone he could pick on, calling Gendry the bastard of nowhere, but he did not push too hard. Perhaps Theon sensed that Ned Stark would not tolerate cruelty to his new ward. Or perhaps Theon sensed the raw power in Gendry's broad shoulders, and the quiet rage lurking behind those clear blue eyes. Indeed, Gendry's anger was rarely visible, but Ned could tell it was there, shaped by years of living a harsh life in the capital with no father, no social standing, and no real future. At Winterfell, for the first time, that anger had a chance to subside, if it was given the right guidance. Time passed, and the chill of autumn gave way to the first snows. While the south might still enjoy a mild season, in the north the cold set in earlier, biting at ears and noses. Gendry learned to layer furs and woolens, to rub his hands with animal fat before going outside for extended periods. He complained little, though he often marveled at how the Starks and their people seemed to handle the cold with ease. One day, as the snow swirled outside the practice yard, Ned watched from a walkway above. Below, Gendry and Robb practiced swordplay under Ser Roderick's watchful eye. Theon lounged nearby, occasionally offering jibes. Arya peered from behind a barrel of straw, enthralled by every clank of wood on wood. Gendry towered over Robb by a small margin, though Robb had the advantage of formal training from a younger age. Despite that, Gendry pushed forward with heavy strikes, and Robb had to stay on the defensive, using his footwork to avoid the boys' powerful swats. They circled each other, breath steaming in the frosty air. "Good," Ser Roderick called. "Robb, keep your shield arm up. Gendry, don't overextend your swing. Let your opponent come to you." Ned leaned on the stone parapet, genuinely impressed. Gendry's improvement over these months was remarkable. He moved with a certain raw grace, a strength that reminded Ned so much of Robert in his youth, the unstoppable fury of a charging stag. In fact, the boy's style was more akin to Robert's old Warhammer tactics than the measured strokes of a longsword. Ned knew that, given time, Gendry might take well to heavier weapons, though for now they taught him fundamentals. When at last Ser Roderick called an end to the session, Robb and Gendry lowered their practice swords. Robb grinned, offering a handshake. Gendry, breathing hard, accepted it. Theon clapped slowly, a faint smirk on his lips, as though mocking them, but there was no true malice in it. Arya hurried forward, ignoring the cold, and blurted out that she wanted to fight too. Ser Roderick sighed in a weary but kind way, telling her that sword fighting was not for little girls, but Arya insisted. Gendry, noticing her eagerness, shrugged and quietly offered her his wooden sword to hold. Arya took it with delight. Ned smiled faintly at the scene. In another world, perhaps the lines between highborn and bastard, lord's daughter and common boy, would stand unbreakable. Yet here, in the yard of Winterfell, the children found a measure of equality in shared curiosity and the forging of skill. He left the walkway and proceeded inside, deciding to visit the godswood. The old, sacred place had always been his refuge from courtly burdens. He passed through the thick stands of sentinel trees, the ground muffled by fresh snow. Steam from the hot springs coiled like ghosts among the trunks. At the heart of the godswood stood the weirwood tree, its bark bone-white and face carved with deep red eyes. The eyes almost bled sap, as though the old gods were weeping. Ned knelt there, closed his own eyes and prayed for guidance, for wisdom in raising Gendry as a ward, for strength to protect his family from the looming troubles that he could sense building in the distance. He thought of Robert's last words to him in King's Landing. "Keep him safe. The boy is my blood." In truth, Gendry was a living symbol of a potential alliance between House Stark and House Baratheon that stood outside of any marriage contract. Should it become common knowledge, the boy's life might be put in even greater peril, but it could also serve as a powerful bond between the North and the Crown, unless the Lannisters moved against them first. Ned worried about that, and about the secrets that had led to Jon Arryn's death. He remembered that the old man had discovered proof that the royal children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, did not share Robert's black hair and deep-set eyes. They were almost certainly the product of incest. Joffrey's claim to the throne might be threatened if ever the truth emerged that Robert had a living bastard boy with the Baratheon look so clearly. Would that incite war? Or might Gendry one day become a piece in that dangerous game, manipulated by others? The wind whispered through the godswood, and Ned found no immediate answers. He only knew that Gendry deserved a chance to grow, to learn, to find his path. If that path shielded the North and the realm from chaos, so be it. Ned would do what he must. Winterfell's daily life had a comforting rhythm. Gendry rose with the sun, breakfasted with the other children in the Great Hall if he chose, then attended arms training or lessons with Maester Luwin. In the afternoons, he helped Mikken at the forge or performed tasks Lady Catelyn deemed fitting for a ward, such as assisting the steward with inventory or riding out with the hunting party to learn how to track and shoot game. At first, he disliked the hunting tasks, for he had no skill with a bow, and the North's wildlife was elusive. Still, he tried, guided by Roderick or sometimes Ned himself, who took the boy aside and showed him how to watch for footprints in the snow or listen for the rustle of brush that indicated an animal's passing. Gendry was often quiet but intent, absorbing every lesson. Over time, his skill improved. He also began to form acquaintances among the young squires and stable boys. He remained somewhat guarded, never fully letting his guard down. But an easy camaraderie began to form when they realized that Gendry had no pretensions of nobility. He was a bastard turned ward, but he could swing a hammer or lift crates alongside the lowliest stable hand. Over pints of ale stolen from the kitchens, older boys would sometimes speak of the battles that might come if the Lannisters challenged the North, or of the rumor that the Targaryen girl across the narrow sea might someday invade. Gendry mostly listened, uncertain what to believe. The wide world outside Winterfell still felt distant, as though it might never reach this snowy keep. Occasionally, Gendry would catch glimpses of Lady Stark watching him. Her expression was composed, but he sensed her uncertainty. Once, he overheard her speaking quietly with Ned in the corridor. "He is polite enough, my lord," she said. "But you cannot deny his presence signals an alliance of sorts with King Robert. The court will not ignore that." "Are you certain?" Ned's reply was lost as they stepped away, but Gendry heard the tension in Lady Stark's voice. He understood even if it stung. He was an outsider, one with uncertain lineage in the eyes of the court, and that might threaten her children's standing if intrigue took root. But the days rolled on without major incident. Gendry found himself surprisingly content. For the first time, he had enough food, clean clothing, a warm bed, and people who taught him skills instead of sneering at him. He tested himself daily with a wooden sword until his arms ached. He pounded away at the forge under Mikken's watchful eye, forging small items, patching armor, learning the intricacies of shaping hot steel. He devoured knowledge from the books Luwin provided, though reading was slow work for him. The more he learned, the more confidence he gained. One evening, in early winter, Ned summoned Gendry to the Great Hall after most of the household had gone to bed. Candles flickered along the long wooden tables, and the hall was empty except for a handful of guards posted at the far end. Ned sat at the dais, gesturing for Gendry to approach. The boy came forward, noticing that a heavy object was wrapped in cloth on the table. Steam from the braziers near the walls drifted upward, warming the air. Ned nodded a greeting. "Sit, lad." Gendry did so, maintaining respectful silence. Ned's gray eyes were somber. "You've been here nearly half a year now. I've been watching your progress. You're growing stronger, better skilled with a blade, more learned. I wanted to speak with you about your future." Gendry's stomach tensed. He thought that perhaps Ned might be sending him away, or that something had gone wrong. "Don't look so fearful," Ned said softly. "You are not in trouble, Gendry. You have done well as a ward. I'm proud in my own way that you've adapted." At these words, Gendry felt an unexpected wave of relief. He kept his face neutral, nodding politely. "Thank you, my lord. I like it here." Ned inclined his head. "And we like having you here. But you must understand that this situation, You're Robert's son." He let the statement hang in the air. "You know that, don't you?" Gendry inhaled, holding his breath. He had known, of course. The king was the man who had taken him aside in the Red Keep, who had, in so many words, claimed him. Yet hearing it spoken aloud hammered it into reality. "Yes, my lord," he said quietly. A long silence stretched. Ned's expression was kind but grave. "You must never speak of it lightly. For your safety, and for the safety of this house, it is best that it remain unspoken unless absolutely necessary. King Robert entrusted you to me, and I will uphold that trust. But you are not to parade that parentage around." Gendry shook his head fervently. "I wouldn't." Ned believed him. "Good. One day word may spread. The realm has a way of uncovering secrets. If that day comes, I want you to stand tall, knowing you have the North behind you. But until then, you are Gendry, ward of House Stark. That is enough." Gendry lowered his gaze, uncertain how to respond. Part of him felt a flicker of pride. He had the North behind him. Part of him felt fear. Would the Lannisters come for him, or attempt to use him in their plots? Ned unwrapped the cloth on the table. It was a short sword, newly forged, gleaming in the candlelight. The simple crossguard had the faint shape of curling ram's horns, a subtle nod to House Baratheon, though not overt. Its pommel was polished iron, shaped to fit the boy's grip. "This is for you," Ned said. "I had Mikken forge it under my direction. You've grown beyond the wooden swords. This is not a noble's showpiece. It's a real blade meant to be used in training and, if need be, in defense. Treat it well." Gendry's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the sword, feeling its balance. It was heavier than the wooden practice swords, yet it felt right in his grip. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing. Show your gratitude through your conduct. Honor the blade as you honor yourself and those who train you." Ned stood, gathering the cloth. "Now it is late. You should rest. There is more training to come, and I expect you to polish that sword properly tomorrow." Gendry nodded. "Yes, my lord, I will." As he left the hall, sword in hand, Gendry felt a curious mixture of joy and anxiety. The blade felt like a symbol. It was more than a weapon, it was a kind of acknowledgement that he was part of something bigger, a piece on the board of lords and kings. He recalled the feel of the forging hammer in his hands, the ring of steel on steel. He walked the corridors of Winterfell, candlelight dancing on the stone walls, and he wondered what the future held for him. Perhaps, one day, he would forge a weapon as fine for himself with the skills he learned at Mikken's side. The thought gave him hope. In the cold hush of night, he smiled. The deeper snows of midwinter settled over the north. The great gates of Winterfell stayed open, though beyond the walls, the roads became treacherous. Twice a raven arrived from King's Landing with news that the Lannisters were maneuvering to consolidate power around the king, to secure positions for their allies. Robert Baratheon had little patience for politics, but cunning men like Littlefinger and Varys whispered that something was brewing, something dark. Ned pored over the letters, brow furrowed. The tension in the realm was growing. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. He took solace only in the fact that Gendry was far removed from the capital's intrigues. On a brisk morning when the sky was bright and cold, Gendry was in the courtyard, practicing sword drills under Theon's lazy supervision. Ser Roderick was busy tutoring Robb and other youths in more advanced combat in the yard. Theon, leaning against a post, offered some mock encouragement. "Go on, you bull, keep swinging. Try not to slice your own feet off." Gendry gritted his teeth and went through the sequence of thrusts, parries, and footwork. He'd do well, then slip, then correct himself. All the while, Theon smirked. Arya eventually strolled by, wearing a heavy cloak and boots, and she paused to watch, arms folded. "Don't you have something better to do, Lady Arya?" Theon drawled, raising an eyebrow. Arya stuck out her tongue. "More fun watching Gendry. At least he's trying." Theon huffed. "Suit yourself." He turned his attention back to Gendry. "Again from the top. And keep that shield closer to your body." Gendry nodded, wiping a bit of sweat from his brow. He started again. His focus was intense, determined. Each time he felt the steel jar in his hand, he remembered the forging process. How raw iron must be hammered, shaped, tempered, quenched. He felt that he was undergoing that same process in Winterfell. Each mistake hammered him, each success tempered him. He exhaled slowly, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, and tried to strike with more precision. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Lady Catelyn was crossing the yard with 2 guardsmen, heading for the gate. It seemed some small entourage was departing, perhaps to the local villages. She glanced in his direction briefly. Her gaze was neither warm nor cold, but it carried that same wariness. Gendry lowered his eyes, focusing on his drill. He had progressed so far from the boy who had first arrived, uncertain and overshadowed. Yet he still felt separate from the others, except maybe Arya, who had a habit of popping up at odd times and asking him about sword strikes and footwork. That day, though, she seemed content to merely watch. Eventually, Theon called a halt, claiming his lordly duties were done. He patted Gendry on the shoulder. Not bad, for a bastard. The words might have stung once, but Gendry was starting to learn that Theon's barbs were half-born from insecurity. So the boy only exhaled and nodded, not letting the insult get under his skin. "Where's Ser Roderick?" Gendry asked, trying to appear casual. Theon pointed to the far end of the yard, where Robb and some older squires were sparring with wooden pikes, busy. "If you want him to train you, you'll have to wait." Gendry decided to watch Robb practice. Arya walked beside him as they moved across the courtyard. She gave Gendry a sideways glance. "You're pretty good now. You might even beat Joffrey if you ever saw him again," she said quietly. Gendry's face hardened. He remembered the smug prince from King's Landing, the snotty blonde boy who had visited the armorer's shop once or twice with the hound following behind. "I'd like to try," he said simply. Arya grinned, showing teeth. "Me too." They paused to watch Ser Roderick correct the posture of a squire. Robb exchanged strikes with a taller boy, their pikes whirling in practiced arcs. Snow fell softly from the sky, adding a hush to the clang of wood on wood. Gendry took mental notes, absorbing every detail, determined to improve. By the time evening fell, Gendry's muscles ached pleasantly from the training. He stowed his sword in his small bedroom, which was simple but comfortable. A narrow bed, a chest for his clothes, and a small table where he kept a few whittled trinkets. No more, no less. He drifted down to the great hall for the evening meal, which was typically a communal affair. Cooked venison, bread, and ale were served in generous quantities. The hall was alive with the warm glow of torches and the chatter of household members, guards, and visitors. Gendry found a seat near the younger squires, though he noticed the Starks at the head table. Lady Stark wasn't present, probably still seeing to her errands. Ned spoke quietly with Robb about something while Sansa answered questions from a visiting retainer about the region's upcoming harvest festival. Arya was nowhere to be seen, likely ladylike ladylike manners somewhere else in the castle. Gendry ate quietly, answering idle questions from the other squires. A few teased him lightly, but it was the sort of teasing that signaled acceptance rather than scorn. He stared at his bowl of venison stew, letting the flavors soak in. If only the kids in Flea Bottom could have such a meal, he thought. If only they could see him now, a ward in Winterfell, wearing decent clothes and training with a sword. The improbable nature of it all still made his head spin. After the meal, he helped carry some trays back to the kitchens, an act that would have surprised some lords, but Ned Stark's household encouraged chores, even among wards and squires. The bustle in the kitchen was frenetic, fires roaring, pots steaming. Gendry slipped out quickly once he had done his share. He wandered the corridors, half thinking he might find Arya or someone else to talk to, but the castle was quiet at this hour, the flicker of torchlight casting dancing shadows on the walls. The illusions of monstrous shapes made him grin inwardly. As a child, that might have frightened him, but after facing the real dangers of King's Landing's alleys, torchlit shadows seemed almost comforting. He passed by the library tower and thought of the dull reading lessons. He found them tedious, but he would not slack. Luwin expected him to improve daily, even if only a little. Learning to read well would be crucial for forging documents, reading battle plans, or understanding the histories that so often shaped men's destinies. Gendry resolved to ask Luwin for a new book on blacksmithing or weapons forging. Perhaps that would keep him awake. Then he heard a muffled shout. Freezing in place, he held his breath and listened. It came from the corridor leading toward the maester's chambers. He crept forward, hand automatically going to the hilt of his new sword, even though it might be frowned upon to draw steel in the corridors of Winterfell without cause. The corridor was dim, lit by a single torch halfway down. Another shout, this time clearer, a man's voice. Gendry moved faster, rounding the corner, and nearly tripped over Theon Greyjoy, who was sprawled in the corridor, wrestling with a man in dark clothing. Gods be damned. Theon cursed, throwing a punch. The intruder wore a dark cloak, face half covered, and he held a dagger. Theon had managed to grab the man's wrist, preventing a stab, but the intruder was strong. A second intruder lay unconscious against the wall, a bruise on his temple. Beyond them, a small chest was overturned, its contents scattered. Gendry took in the scene quickly. Thieves, maybe, or assassins. He had no time to wonder further. The man on Theon's chest twisted, breaking Theon's grip, and raised his dagger for a killing blow. No! Gendry yelled, heart hammering. He yanked out his sword. The intruder jerked his head up, momentarily startled, and that gave Gendry the opening he needed. With a lunge, Gendry slammed the pommel of his sword into the man's temple. He aimed to knock him out rather than skewer him. The blow connected. The man slumped sideways, dagger clattering to the floor. Theon scrambled out from under the unconscious body, panting, his eyes wild. 7 hells, Theon gasped. He looked at Gendry, chest heaving. You brained him. Good job. Breathing hard, Gendry stared at the intruder. What happened? Who are these men? Theon shook his head, pushing a hand through his hair. No idea. They came sneaking around. I heard them rummaging near Maester Luwin's chambers. I told them to identify themselves. They attacked. He spat, looking furious. Before Gendry could respond, the corridor flooded with more light. Ned Stark appeared, followed by 2 guards with torches. What is this commotion? Ned demanded, eyes scanning the scene. The guards rushed forward, seizing both unconscious men. They were thieves, my lord, Theon said, climbing to his feet unsteadily. Or assassins, perhaps. I caught them sneaking. They attacked me. Gendry here saved my hide. Ned's eyes went to Gendry, then to the sword in his hand. His expression softened slightly with relief. Well done, he said to both. He gestured to the guards. Take them to the cells. We'll see who they are and what they were after. His voice carried an edge that promised no mercy. I'll speak to them personally if needed. The guards nodded and dragged the unconscious men away. Ned turned to Theon and Gendry, noting the scuff marks on the floor. Either of you hurt? Theon's lip was bleeding, but he shrugged it off. Gendry shook his head. I'm fine, my lord, he managed. His heart was still hammering. Ned exhaled. Very well. Let's get you both looked at by Maester Luwin, just in case. Then, Theon, you'll recount everything in detail. Gendry's hand was still clenched around his sword hilt. He forced himself to ease his grip. Ned placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder as they walked. You showed bravery, Ned said quietly, and restraint. Gendry swallowed, unsure how to handle praise. Thank you, my lord. Ned gave him a nod. We'll find out who sent them, but for now, know that you did well. A swirl of pride and fear churned in Gendry's chest. This was the first real taste he had of the danger that lurked even in the supposedly safe walls of a great castle. It felt no different than the backstreets of King's Landing. Danger could strike anywhere. Later that night, after Theon and Gendry gave statements and Luwin pronounced them both largely unhurt, Gendry lay awake in his bed for a long time, unable to sleep, the image of the dagger raised over Theon's heart replaying in his mind. He realized that perhaps the intrigues of the South were not so far away after all. By the next morning, word of the incident had spread through Winterfell like wildfire. Men who might have been after documents or valuables, or perhaps something more sinister. No one knew yet. The intruders had carried no identifying tokens, and they weren't willing to talk. They remained chained in the dungeon, battered and silent. The atmosphere in Winterfell turned uneasy. Lady Catelyn returned that day and was disturbed to learn of the incident. She immediately locked down certain sections of the castle, placed additional guards, and insisted that the children keep to the more secure parts of the keep. Ned was in agreement. If men could breach Winterfell once, they might do so again. Gendry found his movements restricted as well, but he understood why. He was, in many ways, as vulnerable a target as any of the Stark children, perhaps more so if any rumor about his parentage had leaked. Several nights later, Ned descended into the dungeons with a handful of guards. Gendry asked if he could come, but Ned forbade it. The next morning, though, Ned quietly informed Gendry that the men had eventually spoken under certain persuasive measures. They had been hired by a minor retainer of House Lannister, though they did not know his name. The plan was to steal letters from Maester Luwin's chambers, letters that might contain references to Gendry's parentage or the alliance between House Stark and King Robert. It seemed they were gathering evidence or seeking to blackmail the king or the Starks, Ned surmised. "Are they going to try again?" Gendry asked, voice subdued. The wind outside rattled the arrow slits in the room. Ned's expression was grim. "Perhaps, but for now we will not make this easy for them. Security will be heightened, and the next time, they'll find Winterfell a less hospitable place." Gendry felt a mixture of relief and dread. If the Lannisters were behind this attempt, then he might be targeted in the future. His breath came a bit faster. "My lord," he ventured, "should I leave? If I'm a danger to you and your family." Ned cut him off with a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. "No, we will protect you as I promised Robert. And as I promised you, you are part of this household now, Gendry. We stand by our own." The words sent a shock of warmth through Gendry's chest. "Part of this household." He nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord." The matter was, for the moment, settled. Life continued, albeit under greater caution. The north wind howled, and the snows piled deeper. Gendry's breath plumed white in the cold air as he continued his training. Ser Rodrik grew harsher with him, pushing him to refine every step, every swing. Gendry took the admonitions quietly, working harder each day. Sometimes he joined Robb, Theon, and a few guards on hunts in the winter-crisp forests around Winterfell, learning to move silently over the snow to track deer or elk. He was not the best archer, but he showed skill in close-quarters tasks, like taking down a wounded buck with a spear or finishing off a boar with a well-placed thrust when it charged. Each success earned him more respect from his companions, including Theon, who grudgingly admitted that Gendry was not a half-bad hunting partner. On a day when the sky seemed to be made of pewter and the snow was piled up to their knees, Gendry trudged out with a group that included Ned, Robb, and Theon to search for a wild elk rumored to be seen near the Wolfswood. The air was frigid, their breath like clouds around their faces. The forest was still, as if blanketed in silence by the heavy snow. They found tracks easily enough, a line of large hoofprints leading deeper into the wood. Ned signaled caution. The group fanned out, Gendry keeping pace with Robb, each boy carrying a spear. The trees towered overhead, evergreen branches drooping with the weight of fresh snow. Somewhere nearby, a raven croaked, and then silence returned. They moved quietly, scanning the undergrowth. Suddenly, Robb froze, pointing. Ahead, a large shape emerged from behind a cluster of pines. A massive elk bull with a sprawling crown of antlers, steam rising from its nostrils as it exhaled in the cold. The beast pawed at the snow, likely searching for moss or lichens. Ned gestured for the group to approach slowly, not wanting to startle the animal into a blind charge. Theon, bow in hand, stepped to the side, nocked an arrow. The wind shifted. The elk's head snapped up, its dark eyes locked on the intruders. The beast snorted and bolted. Ned shouted for them to move, and in a flurry of activity, the group gave chase, stumbling through the snow. Theon loosed an arrow, which grazed the elk's flank, drawing blood but not enough to stop it. The bull bounded forward, hoofs churning up powder. Robb tried to angle around a tree to head it off. Gendry, adrenaline surging, dashed forward, spear at the ready. The elk suddenly wheeled, pivoting in a swirl of snow, and lowered its antlers as Robb closed in. Robb's feet slipped in the deep powder, and the boy went down hard, losing his grip on the spear. The elk bellowed, about to charge him. Gendry reacted without thinking. He leapt into the path of the beast, spear extended, heart hammering. With a thunderous impact, the elk's chest met the spear. The force was shocking, jolting Gendry's arms to the shoulders. The tip slid between the ribs, piercing lung, and the elk reared, legs flailing. For a breathless second, Gendry thought he would be impaled on those antlers. He twisted aside, shoving with all his strength. The elk crashed to the snow, thrashing, its dark blood spraying across the white drift. Gendry felt his boots slip, and he landed heavily on his back, spear twisted from his grip. The bull kicked again, but its strength was already ebbing from the mortal wound. Then Ned appeared with a swift slash of his sword, ending the beast's struggle. Panting, Gendry rolled onto his knees. Robb clambered to his feet, face pale but uninjured. Theon and the others came running. For a moment, no one spoke, breath puffing in the cold air, the forest echoing with the memory of the elk's bellow. Ned surveyed the scene, his face grim with residual fear. "Are you hurt?" he asked both boys. Robb shook his head, brushing off snow. Gendry, chest heaving, also managed a breathless "No." "Gods," Theon muttered. "That was close." Ned nodded, placing a hand on Robb's shoulder, then on Gendry's. "You did well," he told Gendry. "You saved Robb from a goring." Robb swallowed, gazing at the fallen elk. "Thank you," he said, meeting Gendry's eyes. Gendry, still trying to calm his racing heart, just nodded. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Ned said softly. "Not everyone acts so quickly or so bravely." Something unspoken passed between Robb and Gendry then. A sense of deeper camaraderie, perhaps the beginning of genuine friendship. The near miss had forged a stronger bond than all the time spent sparring in the courtyard. Robb Stark, heir of Winterfell, recognized Gendry not as a bastard boy or an outsider, but as a comrade who had risked life and limb to protect him. That meant something. They field-dressed the elk, salvaging as much meat as they could, and dragged it back on a makeshift sled. The trek was difficult, but the men took turns hauling. Robb insisted on doing his share, perhaps feeling the need to prove himself after the mishap. Gendry helped as well, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones. When they finally reached Winterfell, the sun was setting, painting the snow pink. Servants rushed to help, and news of the successful hunt spread quickly. In the great hall, the smell of cooked elk soon mingled with the smoky air, and the story of Gendry's quick action was repeated with growing admiration. That evening, Robb Stark raised a toast to Gendry before the household. While Gendry squirmed in embarrassment, those gathered applauded. Even Sansa, typically aloof in matters of hunts and battles, offered a polite smile. Arya, from her seat near the dais, clapped vigorously, grinning widely. Lady Catelyn inclined her head in acknowledgement, though her expression was more measured. Gendry could not decide if he was more embarrassed or proud. He focused on his cup of mulled wine, sipping carefully and wishing the hall would focus on something else. But a small spark of pride glowed in his chest. He was forging a place here, forging alliances with these people who had taken him in. Afterward, Ned found Gendry outside the great hall, where the boy had escaped to catch a breath of cold night air. In the courtyard, torchlight lit swirls of snow drifting on the wind. Ned approached quietly, wearing a heavy cloak of fur. "Sometimes it's overwhelming," Ned said, as if understanding Gendry's desire for solitude. "But you'll grow used to it, or at least learn to endure it." Gendry exhaled, the vapor trailing away. I've never really been praised like that. A faint smile touched Ned's lips. You earned it, not just for saving Robb, but for how you've handled yourself these past months. I know it's not easy, uprooting your whole life, but you are proving yourself worthy of the trust placed in you. Gendry was quiet for a moment, gazing up at the castle walls. I never thought I'd live in a place like this, or that people like this would accept me. Sometimes I think it's a dream. Ned's voice was gentle, paternal. Winterfell can be your home if you make it so. Whether or not you share our name or the king's name is irrelevant. It's the loyalty you show, the bonds you forge, that make a home. He placed a hand on Gendry's shoulder. One day you may have to decide what to do with the blood in your veins. But that day is not today. For now you're safe. You're learning. And that is all Robert or I could ask of you. Gendry swallowed thickly. He felt an urge to prove himself even further. Thank you, Lord Stark. Ned nodded. Go get some rest. Tomorrow your normal duties resume. Winter does not spare us from daily chores. A ghost of a smile appeared on Gendry's face. Aye, my lord. He bowed his head slightly and turned back toward the warmth of the keep. Crossing the courtyard, Gendry felt more sure-footed than he had in a long time. He might be a bastard, but he was also a ward of Winterfell, and the trust placed in him was as solid as the walls rising around him. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he belonged somewhere, not just as a tool or a laborer, but as a person with real worth. The forging of his identity continued, shaped by the hammer blows of adversity and tempered by the kindness of a family that had embraced him. The path ahead was uncertain, rumors of war, the Lannisters' looming threat, and the question of his own lineage. But Gendry knew one thing. He would face it all, armed with the lessons, the friendships, and the loyalty he was finding here in the frozen heart of the North. In the months that followed, the realm did not settle. Ravens arrived with troubling tidings. King Robert had quarreled openly with Queen Cersei. There were rumors of Tywin Lannister mustering forces at Casterly Rock, and the Iron Islands were stirring with a restlessness that boded ill. Though Winterfell was distant from much of the turmoil, the echoes reached them nonetheless. Ned Stark received letters from the king demanding or requesting this or that. Sometimes Ned would be grim-faced, closeting himself with Maester Luwin for hours. Other times, he would stride through the courtyard with purpose, calling on the loyalty of his bannermen, ensuring the North stood ready in case of conflict. It was during one such flurry of preparation that Gendry found himself called to Ned's solar. The room was warm thanks to a brazier near the corner. Thick rugs covered the floor, and a large table was strewn with maps of Westeros. Ned stood over them, flanked by Robb and Theon. Maester Luwin stood off to the side, discreetly observing. Ned beckoned Gendry forward. "We have received word," Ned said, "that the king may soon demand the presence of the great houses in King's Landing, an attempt to show unity or quell dissent, presumably." He paused, scanning Gendry's face. "If that occurs, it's possible I will bring Robb and Sansa, or perhaps only Robb. The rest of the children may remain here, and you—" He let that hang. "I have not decided if it's wise to bring you or safer to keep you here." Robb looked at Gendry, sympathy in his eyes. Theon smirked faintly. "Might be a bit awkward, the king's bastard wandering about the court," Theon said, half-jesting. Ned shot him a warning look and Theon shrugged. Gendry felt his stomach twist. The thought of returning to King's Landing, where he had lived in the slums, where men might try to use him or kill him, unnerved him. Yet part of him wanted to face it to prove he was not a coward. "I'll do as you command, my lord." Ned nodded approval at his tactful response. "We'll see. For now, continue your training, your studies, and help prepare the men for winter. The king may or may not call on us soon, but we must be ready." As Gendry stepped out of the solar, he caught Robb's eye. The older boy gave him a reassuring nod, as if to say, "We'll handle whatever comes." Gendry walked down the corridor, mind racing. If Ned did bring him back to King's Landing, what would that mean? Would King Robert acknowledge him openly, or keep him hidden? Would the Queen or the Lannisters try to harm him? He felt a flicker of fear, but then he remembered the forging of steel. How fear was normal, how it must be mastered by heat and hammer until you shaped yourself into something unbreakable. He resolved not to dwell on it. Winterfell was his immediate reality, and here he would continue to grow. He immersed himself in his chores, in sword practice, and in forging. Mikken let him help craft small components for the castle's weaponry: arrowheads, rivets, buckles for armor straps. Gendry pounded metal until sweat slicked his brow, the heat of the forge banishing the northern chill. Each clang of the hammer felt like a heartbeat, driving him forward. On one such afternoon, Arya burst into the smithy, her cheeks red from the cold, her hair tousled. "Gendry," she called over the hiss of the forge bellows. "Let's spar. Rob's off with father, and I can't find Theon." Mikken frowned. "Out, girl, you're letting the cold in." Arya paid him no mind. Gendry set down the tongs, wiped his hands on a rag. "Can't spar now. Busy," he muttered, but he could not help smiling a bit at her eagerness. Arya rolled her eyes dramatically. "You're always busy. Come on, I'm bored. Ser Roderick won't train me. He says it's unseemly for a lady." She practically spat the word. Mikken shook his head but kept working at the anvil. Gendry shrugged, then relented. "Fine, but only for a bit." He hung up his apron, dusted off his breeches, and walked with Arya to a corner of the yard where they kept a few practice swords. Arya grabbed the smallest one, a wooden sword that had been crafted for younger children. Gendry took another slightly larger one, twirling it lightly in his grip. They faced each other in the chilly yard, snow clinging to the edges. Arya squared her feet, determined to mimic the stances she had seen the boys use. Gendry offered her a quick pointer. "Keep your elbows in," he said. "You're leaving your ribs open." She nodded, then lunged. He parried easily, stepping aside. She advanced again with surprising speed for her size. He blocked, stepped back, blocked again, then gave a gentle counterstrike that tapped her shoulder. She scowled. "Again?" she demanded. They repeated the sequence time after time. Arya improved with each attempt, adjusting her footing. She even managed to sneak in a glancing strike on Gendry's thigh at one point. He feigned a grunt, exaggerating it to make her grin. They fell into a rhythm of practice and laughter. Snow drifted lazily around them. A few onlookers passed by, guards, stable hands, but none intervened. Arya's mother might have disapproved, but Lady Stark was nowhere in sight. Perhaps that was for the best. When at last Arya's arms shook with weariness, they lowered their swords, breathing hard, puffs of white in the air. She beamed up at Gendry. "If Ser Roderick won't teach me, you will, won't you?" Gendry chuckled, ruffling her hair. "You're a stubborn little thing, aren't you?" She feigned a scowl. "Don't call me little. I'm going to be a great warrior. You'll see." He grinned. "I believe you." She nodded, satisfied, and dashed off, presumably to brag to someone about the bruises she'd inflicted. Gendry watched her go, warmed by the moment of simple camaraderie. For a time, the weight of politics and bastard secrets lifted, replaced by the innocent spark of a child's dream to be something more than her station allowed. Late that night, Gendry settled into his bed, muscles pleasantly sore from forging and sparring. His mind churned with thoughts. The possibility of returning to King's Landing, the threat of Lannister meddling, the shift in the realm's stability. But these worries could not fully erode the sense of belonging he had found. Slowly, he drifted into a deep sleep. In his dream, he stood in the courtyard of Winterfell, but the walls stretched higher than any mountain. A giant hammer lay in his hands, its head carved with the sigil of a stag, and a dire wolf prowled at his side. Snow fell in thick flakes, yet he felt warm, unafraid. A storm raged beyond the walls, filled with roaring lions, but the gates of the keep stood strong, forged with steel that glowed red-hot as though just pulled from the fire. Gendry lifted the hammer, feeling power surge through him. A voice echoed. Ned Stark's voice, Robert's voice, a dozen voices, and then the dream dissolved into a swirl of white. He woke with a start, heart pounding, uncertain what the vision meant. But something about it filled him with a quiet resolve. He was forging himself. A blade or a hammer, it did not matter, in the heat of the North's trials. The forging would continue, as would the alliance between House Stark and House Baratheon, sealed by a boy who carried the stag's blood, guarded by the wolves of the North. Much lay ahead, struggles, triumphs, perhaps tragedy. But for now, Gendry belonged, and that was enough to set him on the path toward whatever fate might await him, be it in the North's icy lands or the intrigues of the southern courts. He closed his eyes again, letting the warmth of the firs envelop him. Somewhere far away, a cold wind howled, but within the stone walls of Winterfell, Gendry found a glimmer of peace. He had a life here, friends, something akin to family. In his heart, he whispered a silent prayer to the old gods and the new, to keep the forge of his spirit blazing bright, so that no matter what storms might batter the walls, he would stand as firm and unyielding as the steel he shaped. Over the next weeks, Winterfell's routines continued in a rhythm of training, feasting, and vigilance. The harsh winds blew snow across the battlements, sometimes piling drifts against the walls so high that the stable boys had to shovel for hours just to clear a path. Gendry learned to navigate these snow-choked corridors and courtyards as if he'd been born a true northerner, though he still marveled at the unrelenting chill. At the forge, Mikken kept the fires roaring, sweat beading on his brow even in the dead of winter, and Gendry's days passed in a whirl of hammer blows and steel shapes, forging nails, hinges, arrowheads, and the occasional simple blade. Every clang of metal reminded him of the forging he underwent as a person, shaped by this northern life and hammered into new form by Ned Stark's guidance. One afternoon, a raven arrived bearing the seal of the crown. The bird fluttered into the rookery, depositing a scroll that made Maester Luwin's expression turn grave. Moments later, a quiet summons beckoned Ned Stark to the Maester's turret. Lady Catelyn, ever alert, joined him. Gendry, returning from the smithy, spotted them ascending the tower steps. Curious and uneasy, he quickened his pace. At the top of the winding staircase, he paused outside the half-closed door, hearing murmured voices within. It wasn't his place to eavesdrop, so he made to turn away, when Ned's voice rose, quiet but firm. "Robert demands my presence in King's Landing again, and this time he wants the entire Stark family in attendance for a royal feast of some kind. He claims it's to quell rumors that the crown is divided." Lady Catelyn's voice followed. "Will you go?" Pause, then Ned sighed. "I may have no choice, but the Lannisters will be waiting, and I have Gendry to think about." Gendry's heart thumped. The mention of his name in that context was enough to root him to the spot, though a flutter of guilt nagged at him for listening in. He tried not to betray himself with any sound. Inside, Maester Luwin cleared his throat. The letter states the king's intention quite plainly. He wants the realm to see the loyalty of the North. If you refuse or if you come alone, it might signal that House Stark stands apart. In these times, we cannot afford that perception. Catelyn spoke again, measured. "What of Gendry? Is Robert specifically asking for him? Or is his presence implied?" "No mention," Ned replied. "But he is my ward. If we all travel, it would seem odd to leave him behind, especially given the pretense of a full household gathering. However, traveling to King's Landing will place him under the Lannisters' eyes." Catelyn's silence was heavy. Then she said, "If the king needs him there, is it not Robert's responsibility to keep him safe from his own in-laws? Or do we not trust Robert enough?" Ned's answer came after a thoughtful pause. "I trust Robert's intentions toward the boy, but I do not trust the Lannisters, and Robert is often too distracted or too easily swayed by council members who do not have Gendry's best interests at heart. Still, the king is summoning us. Perhaps it's time we gather our strength and show that we do not fear cunning schemes." Gendry took a step away, heart pounding. He was about to retreat down the steps when the door opened, revealing Ned's tall figure. Startled, Gendry froze, caught red-handed. Ned studied him for a moment. The flicker in the Lord's eyes spoke of understanding. He gestured for the boy to come in. Gendry ducked his head and obeyed, feeling a rush of self-consciousness. "It seems you've heard enough," Ned said, not unkindly. "We are summoned to King's Landing." Gendry looked from Ned to Lady Catelyn, then to Maester Luwin, who held the parchment. "My lord, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to pry. I just—" Lady Catelyn's expression remained guarded, though not unkind. "This letter concerns you as much as anyone. The king wishes for us all to gather at the capital for a show of unity." Ned motioned to the scroll. "They specify the presence of my household, but not you by name. We must decide what's best for your safety." Gendry felt a strange mix of dread and an odd excitement. The idea of returning to King's Landing brought memories of Flea Bottom, of those cramped streets and the danger he'd escaped. Yet part of him wanted to prove himself, to show that he wasn't just a stray dog skulking in the north. "If you think I should go, I'll go," he said, voice steady. "If you think I should stay, I'll stay." Ned regarded him with a thoughtful gaze. "Your loyalty is commendable. We have some days to finalize our plans, but I must answer the king soon." Maester Luwin spoke gently. "King's Landing is a viper's nest these days. But sometimes it's best to face a viper with your allies at your side than to hide away." Catelyn flicked her eyes between them. "We can't be certain the king is calling us for a simple feast. This could be about politics, alliances, or rumors of unrest. We must be prepared for anything." Ned set a hand on Gendry's shoulder. "I'll do all in my power to keep you safe, whether here or there. In the meantime, carry on as you have. If we decide to bring you, you'll travel with us in the retinue." Gendry nodded. His stomach churned, but he tried to appear calm. After Ned dismissed him, he made his way to the courtyard, half expecting the crisp air to clear his mind. He found Robb practicing sword forms with Theon, their wooden blades arcing in slow, deliberate motions. Arya was nowhere to be seen, probably off lurking near the stables or the godswood. Gendry paused at the edge of the yard, watching Robb's smooth footwork. Robb caught sight of him and lowered his practiced sword. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Gendry hesitated, considering how much to reveal. "A raven from the capital," he said simply. "Your father might be taking us there." A gleam of intrigue lit Robb's eyes. The capital still held a certain fascination for him. He'd only visited briefly, and he'd been younger then. Theon quirked an eyebrow, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sounds like another royal summons. Maybe you'll get to see the king again. Show him how tall you've grown." Robb let out a short laugh. "Or show him how we fight in the north." "You don't seem very excited, Gendry." Gendry shrugged. "I used to live there, remember? It's not exactly friendly, especially if the Lannisters know who I am." Theon gave a careless wave of his hand. "It'll be fine, you big bull. We'll have a whole host of Northmen. The Lannisters aren't about to start a war in the streets." Robb's expression grew more serious. "Still, father will be cautious. The queen might take offense at something so small, or Joffrey might pick a fight. We'll have to keep our wits about us." Gendry nodded, that swirl of unease still in his gut. He wished he could be as confident as Theon, or as level-headed as Robb. But memories of Flea Bottom's filth, the watchful eyes of the gold cloaks, and the knowledge that Lannister men had recently tried to steal documents in Winterfell all weighed on him. This wasn't a simple trip to the market. This was entering the lion's den. For the next few days, the castle stirred with preparations. Lady Catelyn organized the household staff to ready supplies, choose wagons, and select which members of the Stark retinue would accompany them. Robb's personal guard was handpicked by Ned to ensure maximum loyalty. Discussions arose over who would remain to govern Winterfell in the family's absence. Eventually, it was decided that Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick Castle would oversee matters in the castle, and that Bran, who was too young to make the journey, might stay behind if his mother deemed it best. Though Bran protested, Lady Catelyn wanted to keep at least one child in Winterfell's safety. Arya insisted she was going, and Sansa was delighted by the prospect of court. Rickon was deemed far too young for the journey, so he would remain with old Nan. When the final decision was made, Gendry was summoned to Ned's solar once more. He entered to find Ned seated behind his desk, Catelyn at his side, and Robb standing with arms folded. The winter sunlight streamed through the narrow window, casting a pale glow across the maps and letters strewn about. Ned met Gendry's gaze. "I've decided you will come with us. You'll ride under House Stark's banner as my ward. We'll keep your identity obscured as best we can, but if rumors arise, we'll handle them together." "Understood." "Yes, my lord," Gendry said, stiff with determination. "Thank you." Catelyn observed him, her expression measured. "Know that this will place you close to the king's circle. There may be questions or pressures that you have never faced before. You must remember your duty to House Stark. Do not let any honeyed tongues draw you into secrets or bargains." Gendry nodded, gulping. "I'll keep my head down." Robb offered a reassuring grin. "And if you have any trouble, you come to us. The North stands together." That evening, Gendry packed his meager possessions. He wrapped his sword in oilcloth, made sure the small trinkets he'd carved, a wolf figurine for Arya, a simplified blacksmith's hammer for himself, were tucked safely away, and folded the decent clothes he owned. His biggest concern was the coat and gloves strong enough to withstand the winter roads. He was told the king wanted this gathering to occur soon, so they would travel at once, making for White Harbor first and then taking a ship south. That route, Ned explained, would be quicker than riding all the way down the King's Road through the treacherous mountain passes. On the morning of departure, the courtyard of Winterfell bustled with commotion. Horses nickered, stamping the frozen ground. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies. Stable boys rushed about, and guards checked harnesses and saddles. Snow dusted everything, swirling around the traveling party. Gendry, dressed in layers of wool and leather, felt an odd pang of regret to be leaving the place that had become home. He patted the side of his sturdy mare and glanced around, taking in the gray stone walls, the steaming hot pools near the glass gardens, and the watchful towers. No matter what happened in King's Landing, a part of him would always long for the crisp clarity of the North. He mounted up beside Robb, who looked every inch the Lord's heir in fur-trimmed cloak and leather armor. Behind them, Arya sat astride a small filly, her excitement barely contained. Sansa rode near Lady Catelyn's wagon, prim and proper, daydreaming aloud about the capital's lavish balls and feasts. Theon trotted around, jesting with the guards. Ned Stark, wrapped in a heavy cloak, directed the final checks with calm efficiency. Once he was satisfied, he turned to the party, raised his gloved hand in silent command, and they set off, passing through Winterfell's gates into a world of white. Their journey to White Harbor proved a chilly affair, but relatively safe. The group was large enough to deter bandits. At small villages, folk came out to greet them, bowing and waving to Lord Stark and his family. Some children gaped at the traveling retinue, pointing at the sleek horses and fine cloaks. Gendry, once one of those awestruck small folk, felt a strange reversal now that he rode with lords and ladies. He saw himself in those gawking faces and tried to offer small smiles when he could, remembering the gulf that separated the highborn from the humble. White Harbor rose before them after a week of steady travel, its walls gleaming by the waters of the Bight. Here, the party boarded a sleek ship belonging to House Manderly, who welcomed them warmly. The days at sea were cold, the wind whipping across the deck, but Gendry found it easier than the sweltering roads of the south. They sailed along the eastern coastline, passing by the rocky shores of the Vale. Sea spray mingled with crisp winter air. Robb occasionally joined Gendry at the prow, pointing out distant landmasses or describing how he'd once dreamed of traveling west across the sunset sea like some explorers of old. Arya, meanwhile, prowled the ship's decks, scurrying into corners with needle in hand. Her small rapier that Ned had quietly commissioned after discovering her passion for swordplay. Sansa spent her time with her mother or practicing her needlework in a sheltered nook, avoiding the wind that tangled her hair. Gendry mostly helped the sailors with menial tasks, coiling rope, checking cargo. He had strong arms from forging, and his willingness to pitch in earned him the sailors' good humor. They teased him for his broad shoulders, calling him the Bull, and he found himself half amused, half embarrassed. At last, the ship rounded the Cape of Eagles and made for the Blackwater Bay. The temperature rose slightly as they moved further south, though it still felt damp and chill in the sea winds. One dawn, Gendry woke early to find the silhouette of kings landing on the horizon. Towers and spires rising out of the haze, the city sprawling beyond its walls like a hungry beast. Memories of Flea Bottom's stench and the clangor of city life came rushing back. He swallowed hard, uncertain what he would find there now. The Lannisters, the king, the swirling game of court. He steeled himself, reminding himself that he was no longer the armorer's apprentice sleeping in a corner of a workshop. He was a ward of House Stark, and the North had his back. Their ship docked at the busy harbor, where dockworkers, fishmongers, and merchants shouted amid the constant thud of cargo being hoisted ashore. Guards in Stark livery formed a protective cordon as Ned and his family disembarked. Theon hopped onto the wharf with a grin, stretching his legs. Arya wrinkled her nose at the fishy smell. Sansa clutched her mother's arm, eyes wide at the sheer crush of people. Gendry felt a tremor of old familiarity, remembering how these docks could be a haven for pickpockets and cut purses. He kept his hand near the hilt of his sword. A contingent of gold cloaks arrived to escort them up to the Red Keep. Their captain stepped forward, offering a stiff bow to Lord Stark. "We've been commanded to see you and your family safely to the castle, my lord. The king awaits." Ned nodded. "Lead on, then." They mounted up, though travel through the city would be slow. The roads were thick with people, and the noise hammered at Gendry's ears. Stall after stall sold trinkets, fish, bread, cheap wines. The smells assaulted his senses: sweat, dung, rotting refuse, cooking meat. It was a far cry from the clean cold of Winterfell. He noted how Arya's initial excitement turned to disillusion as they pressed deeper into the city's chaos. Sansa looked overwhelmed, eyes drifting over the cramped buildings and ragged urchins. More than once, Theon quipped about how he preferred Winterfell's crisp air to this. Robb rode steadily, quiet, absorbing the atmosphere with a frown. And Gendry gazed upon Flea Bottom in the distance, that labyrinth of narrow alleys and lean-tos. He saw half-familiar corners, though they were masked by the swirling tide of humanity. He wondered about the old armorer's shop, about the men who once teased him there. Little had changed, it seemed, in the city's underbelly. Yet everything had changed for him. Finally, their procession wound up the steep streets toward the Red Keep, a fortress of red stone perched high above the rest. Gendry remembered how imposing it looked from below. Now, it felt no less intimidating. The gates loomed, and the guards parted to admit them. Within the keep's walls, courtiers, knights, and servants bustled in a swirl of color. Purple banners with the golden lion of Lannister hung alongside the black stag of Baratheon. Soldiers in crimson cloaks patrolled, and Gendry tensed at the sight of them. Not all were Lannister men, but many carried themselves with an arrogant air, proud to serve the Queen's house. As they reached the massive courtyard, King Robert himself emerged, his gait unsteady from too much feasting or drink, perhaps both. Even so, his presence still carried a boisterous weight. He wore rich clothing, a fur-trimmed cloak, and a crown that tilted slightly on his dark hair. Behind him stood Queen Cersei, her golden hair gleaming, her green eyes calculating. To her side were Prince Joffrey, Princess Myrcella, and little Prince Tommen, each dressed in regal finery. Ned dismounted first, bowing. The Stark family followed suit, though Arya performed a quick, awkward bob, and Sansa sank into a more graceful curtsy. Gendry, waiting behind them, felt a pulse of dread at the sight of the Queen. He lowered his gaze, stepping off his horse. Robert strode forward and embraced Ned in a bone-crunching hug, ignoring the formalities. "Gods, it's good to see you, Ned," the king boomed, his laughter echoing. Ned gave a brief smile. "Your Grace, we came as you requested." Robert then looked at the Stark children. "Robb, you've grown tall as a weirwood. Sansa, you're a vision of your mother's beauty. Arya, by the gods, you look like a wolf pup ready to bite my ankles." Arya scowled, which made Robert chuckle. Queen Cersei drifted forward, speaking in a cool voice. "Welcome back to King's Landing, Lord Stark. We trust your journey was not too taxing." Her eyes flicked over Ned, then Catelyn, then the children. Gendry wondered if she would notice him lurking in the background. If she recognized him, she gave no sign. Instead, her gaze swept over him and the others with practiced disinterest. Robert continued with bombast. "Come, you must be starving. We'll have a feast tonight in your honor. I expect you all to attend. Joffrey, come greet your betrothed." At that, the handsome but sullen Prince Joffrey stepped forward, offering Sansa a stiff bow. She curtsied back, cheeks flushed. Gendry watched the exchange from a distance, remembering the glimpses of Joffrey he had seen in the city, how the prince moved with a constant sneer. Joffrey's eyes flickered dismissively across the Stark retinue. For a moment, Gendry worried that Joffrey might recognize him from the times the prince had visited the armorer's shop, but Joffrey offered no sign of recollection. To him, Gendry was just another soldier or minor retainer. In the swirl of welcomes, Gendry managed to keep to the edge, bowing politely when protocol demanded. Queen Cersei gave him a brief glance, but Robert paid no direct attention to him just yet. Instead, the king beckoned Ned to walk with him. The queen, children in tow, swept indoors. Sansa went with them, as did Arya, though Gendry could see the younger Stark girl glaring at Joffrey's back, clearly unimpressed. Theon joined Gendry, letting out a low whistle. "Well, we're here in one piece. That's something." A steward approached them, instructing Gendry, Theon, and others where their quarters would be. They followed him inside, through winding corridors of red stone, tapestries depicting royal hunts and battles. The opulence of the Red Keep felt stifling compared to the stark simplicity of Winterfell. Torches glowed in golden sconces, and the floors were polished marble. Guards in Lannister colors stood at intersections, watchful. They passed open windows that revealed the city below and the glittering waters of Blackwater Bay. Gendry cast a glance down, fighting the surge of memories from his days as a lowly apprentice. Eventually, they reached a set of chambers designated for the Stark wards and companions. The rooms were well appointed, with thick curtains, carved wooden furniture, and soft beds, a luxury in Gendry's eyes. He recalled sleeping on a pallet of straw next to the furnace. He set his things down, exhaling. That night, a lavish feast was held in the throne room and then in the grand banquet hall of the Red Keep. The great iron throne loomed at one end, a twisted mass of swords rumored to cut those unworthy who sat upon it. Servants in gold and crimson livery led guests past the throne into a hall bedecked with banners of black stags and gold lions. Musicians played stringed instruments, their music echoing in the high rafters. The aroma of roasted boar, spiced wine, and sweet pastries wafted through the air. Gendry was seated at a table near Robb, Theon, and a cluster of other northern retainers. Ned and Lady Catelyn sat at the high table with the king and queen, along with Sansa and Arya. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen sat on Robert's other side, accompanied by the Hound, his scarred visage as grim as ever. Gendry felt a pang of unease at the sight of Sandor Clegane. The man had visited the armorer's shop in the past, looming like a hound ready to bite. He wondered if the Hound remembered him. Amid the clamor of conversation and the tinkling of silverware, Gendry tried to remain inconspicuous. He ate quietly, listening to northern knights jest among themselves. Robb occasionally engaged him in conversation, but mostly the older boy was occupied with greeting other lords who came by to pay respects to the Stark heir. Theon, never shy, flirted with a passing serving girl until a guard shot him a warning glance. During a lull in the music, the king rose to propose a toast. Robert's face was already ruddy from drink. He lifted a goblet high, a toast to House Stark, who have answered the call of the crown with their presence, braving the winter roads. May their swords remain sharp and their hearts true. We welcome them to our halls as brothers. All around, courtiers applauded politely. Robert drained his goblet in a single gulp. Then he laughed, calling for more wine. Ned stood next, offering a gracious reply about the bond between the North and the Crown. Gendry's attention drifted. He spied Queen Cersei watching Ned with a tight smile, and Joffrey whispering something to Myrcella that made her giggle. It all felt like a performance, a veneer of civility masking deeper tensions. When the feast ended, guests began drifting away in clusters, some to their own chambers, others to continue drinking in smaller gatherings. Robb motioned for Gendry to follow him and Theon out of the hall. The trio passed along a corridor with a handful of other Stark men, discussing the grandness of the event. Theon made offhand comments about how bored he was by all the southern finery, though Gendry suspected Theon secretly relished it. Robb was subdued, likely reading the atmosphere, wary of the Lannisters' presence. They reached their chambers and Gendry prepared to retire. Before he could close his door, Theon lingered. "You all right there, Bull?" he asked, using that half-teasing nickname. "Haven't seen you say much since we arrived." Gendry shrugged. "It's overwhelming, this place. There's too many eyes, too many ears. I'd rather be forging in Winterfell." Theon smirked. Well, you best get used to it. We might be stuck here a while." Robb, from the corridor, nodded in agreement. "Father won't rush away if the king wants us here. We'll just have to keep watch for trouble. Good night, Gendry." They parted. Gendry shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling. The chamber felt stifling, even though it was far grander than anything he'd had before. He wondered if this was how life in King's Landing would always feel, caught between fear and the showy spectacle of royal life. He had a sense that the real dangers were still hidden beneath the surface. In the days that followed, Ned and Catelyn attended countless meetings with the king and his council. Sansa was whisked into the orbit of princesses and ladies at court, while Arya tried her best to avoid the lessons imposed on her. Robb occasionally joined his father in official matters, learning the ways of politics. Theon vanished at intervals, likely finding taverns or gambling dens that catered to young men with silver in their pockets. Gendry was left in a curious limbo. He had no official role besides being Ned's ward, so he trained in the Red Keep's yard with the Stark guards, or else wandered the keep's labyrinthine hallways. Sometimes, he visited the castle's smithy out of habit, though the master armorer there was suspicious, demanding to know Gendry's business. One morning, while crossing a lesser courtyard, Gendry was hailed by a familiar voice. He turned to see none other than the Hound, Sandor Clegane, looming in partial armor. The man's burned face twisted in a sneer. You look different than most of these northern pups. What's your name?" Gendry's pulse kicked. Did the Hound remember him from the workshop? He forced an even tone. "I'm Gendry, my lord. I'm a ward of House Stark." Sandor barked a laugh. "Lord? I'm no lord, you whelp. I remember your face, though. Didn't you used to run messages for that armorer in Flea Bottom, Tobo Mott, was it?" A wave of apprehension washed over Gendry. So the Hound did recall. "Aye, before I was taken north as a ward." Something grim flickered in Sandor's eyes. "Ward, is it? Ah, so the wolf took in a bastard boy from the gutters. Strange times." He snorted, then gripped Gendry's shoulder, not gently. "Better watch yourself in this den of liars, boy. There are men who'd slit your throat just for sport." The heavy hand fell away, and Gendry suppressed a shiver. "I'll be careful." The Hound studied him a moment longer, then walked off, leaving Gendry unsettled. So at least one person at court knew him from his old life. How long before rumors spread? Would Joffrey realize who Gendry was if the Hound mentioned it? That night, Gendry found himself drifting through the Red Keep's corridors after supper, restless. The flicker of torchlight illuminated murals and tapestries. He headed for a small courtyard he'd discovered, a quiet place with a single weirwood sapling and a fountain. The night air was mild compared to Winterfell's biting cold. Stars glittered overhead. He reached the courtyard and paused, taking in the hush of water trickling into the fountain's basin. He was not alone. Seated on a stone bench, a cloaked figure looked up, revealing Arya's face. She seemed startled, then relaxed when she recognized Gendry. "You scared me," she muttered. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping closer. "What are you doing out here?" She shrugged. "Hiding. I hate those stuffy rooms and those ladies who keep telling me to hold my spoon this way or curtsy that way. I wanted some air. Gendry settled on the bench beside her, keeping a bit of distance. I can't say I blame you. King's Landing is too cramped. Arya nodded vigorously. I miss Winterfell already. You too. More than anything. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the fountain's gentle murmur. Arya tapped her foot, restless energy radiating off her. Father won't let me do any real sword training here. Says it's not safe or it's not proper or something. They have a master at arms, but he just bows and smiles at me. He won't teach me. Gendry considered. He's probably too afraid of crossing your father's wishes. Maybe you could ask the Hound. He joked, though the idea horrified him. Arya made a face. I'd rather stab myself. She sighed. What about you? Do you have anything to do here besides shuffle around and wait for father's word? I train with the Stark guards. It's not bad, but it's not the same. I keep looking over my shoulder, worried someone will realize who I really am. Arya tilted her head. Who you really are. You're Gendry. The rest shouldn't matter. He gave a small, grateful smile, though a knot of worry remained. I wish it were that simple. She studied him, then hopped up from the bench. Want to spar? Just a little? He blinked. Now? It's nearly midnight. Arya's grin was mischievous. All the better. No one will bother us. She drew a wooden practice sword from under her cloak. She'd clearly smuggled it from somewhere. Gendry laughed under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He stood, shrugged off his own cloak, and rolled his shoulders. All right, if it'll help you sleep. But gently. We can't wake half the castle. In the moonlit courtyard, they went through some basic drills, trying not to clack the wood too loudly. Arya's quickness and growing skill impressed him. She darted in with jabs and slashes, her slight frame forcing her to rely on speed rather than brute force. Gendry defended lightly, occasionally tapping her arm or shoulder in a reminder to keep her guard tight. Though it was far from a formal lesson, Arya drank in every tip eagerly. It lasted only a few minutes before they heard footsteps echoing. They froze. A pair of gold cloaks on night patrol passed by an archway, their lantern light flickering across the ground. Arya pressed herself against the wall, Gendry following suit. The guards paused, scanning the courtyard. Gendry's heart hammered. If they were caught sparring at this hour, especially with the Lady Arya, who knew what trouble might ensue? The guards seemed not to notice them in the shadows. After a tense moment, the men continued on, boots ringing on stone. Arya let out a breath she'd been holding, her eyes shining with excitement. See? This is fun. Gendry frowned. You're mad. You know that? But he couldn't help the hint of a smile that tugged at his mouth. When they parted, returning to their respective chambers, Gendry felt a measure of warmth in his chest. Even in this city of schemes, he had a friend willing to risk a late-night spar just to keep her skills sharp. Perhaps they could endure this place after all. But the respite was short. In the following weeks, the undercurrent of tension grew stronger. Robert summoned Ned to council meetings daily, sometimes with Catelyn and Robb in attendance. Word spread that Tywin Lannister was mustering forces at the western borders, claiming it was to drive off outlaw bands. Whispers reached Gendry's ears about the possibility of war should the king confront the Lannisters too openly. Adding to the strain, rumors circulated that Stannis Baratheon had left Dragonstone and might be forging alliances of his own. The entire realm seemed on the brink of fracturing. Amid the swirl, Gendry kept his head down. He followed the routine of training, meals, and errands for Ned or Maester Luwin. Occasionally, he glimpsed King Robert in the corridors, escorted by his Kingsguard or by a flurry of courtiers. Once, Robert caught sight of Gendry and paused, looking the boy over with a faint, almost imperceptible sign of recognition. Then he clapped Ned on the shoulder and moved on. Gendry felt a pang of something, resentment, maybe, or longing. The king was his father by blood, but offered no direct word of acknowledgement. Gendry told himself it was safer that way, better to remain a shadow, but the emotion still lurked, unspoken. Early one morning, while Gendry sparred with one of the Stark guards in a small training yard, a pair of Lannister soldiers entered, leaning against the wall to watch. Gendry felt their gaze on him, unsettling. When his bout ended, he set his practiced sword aside, panting lightly. One soldier, older and broad across the chest, stepped forward. "You've got strength, boy," the man said, smiling without warmth. "Who trained you?" "Ser Roderick Castle," Gendry answered warily. "And the men of Winterfell." The soldier's eyes narrowed slightly. "Winterfell. I see." He paused. "You look familiar, in a way. Have you lived in the city long?" Gendry stiffened. "No," he lied. "Just arrived with the Starks." The soldier exchanged a glance with his companion, who shrugged. They departed with an air of curiosity, and Gendry could almost feel the suspicion they left behind. He told the guard he'd been sparring with that he'd had enough for the day, then hurried back inside. Perhaps he was imagining things, but the memory of the intruders who'd broken into Winterfell's library to find evidence of his parentage haunted him. The Lannisters were not fools. If any rumor about Gendry spread, he could become a target. That evening, as Gendry walked the corridors, heading for Ned Solar to deliver a message from Maester Luwin, he saw Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, lurking near the foot of a staircase. The man was slender, with a pointed beard and mocking eyes. He inclined his head when he spotted Gendry, as if greeting an old friend. Gendry tried to move past quickly, but Littlefinger stepped into his path. "You're a new face here," Littlefinger said, voice silken. "Or perhaps not so new, if one knows where to look. You must be the Stark ward I've heard whispers about." Gendry forced a neutral expression. "My lord," he said politely, giving the briefest bow. "I'm on an errand for Lord Stark." Baelish's lips curved in a cunning smile. "So diligent. One must admire the Starks for their sense of duty. So you're Gendry, yes?" His eyes flicked over Gendry's frame in the manner of a man assessing a piece of merchandise. "Quite the build. Some say you favored the hammer in your younger days, forging away in a flea-bottom shop." Gendry's mouth went dry. This man was dangerous. His information network was legendary. "I don't know what you mean," Gendry mumbled, trying to sidestep him. Littlefinger chuckled. "Of course you don't." He stepped aside, letting Gendry pass. "Be sure to give Lord Stark my regards, won't you?" Gendry hurried on, not daring to look back. Fear churned in his stomach. If Baelish was already hinting at knowledge of his past, others might also be aware. So far, no one had confronted him openly about being the king's bastard, but that didn't mean they wouldn't use the information at a time and place that benefited them. Entering Ned Solar, Gendry found the lord standing by a brazier, arms folded. Robb was there too, his posture tense, and Catelyn stood near the window. Gendry delivered the parchment from Luwin, then stepped back, uncertain if he was interrupting. The atmosphere was grim. Ned sighed, glancing at Gendry. "We've received news that Tywin Lannister has marched into the Riverlands, apparently to quell outlaws, but the Tullys are taking it as aggression. There's bloodshed reported near the border. This could escalate swiftly." Catelyn's face was pale. "My father is old, and my brother Edmure commands the River Lords. They may well call on us for aid." Gendry felt a knot in his chest, though he was no expert on politics. War sounded terrifying. Robb set his jaw. "If they call, we must respond. The Riverlands are Lady Catelyn's homeland, and by extension, our allies." Ned took a moment before responding. "Yes, but we're in King's Landing at the King's request. If we raise forces from here, we risk defying the crown. Robert is as angry with Tywin as we are, but the Queen—" He broke off, pressing his lips tight. Robb breathed heavily. "And so we're stuck, while Lannisters run rampant?" Gendry took a step forward, though he doubted his voice mattered in this council. "Isn't the king able to stop Lord Tywin?" Ned shook his head, expression torn. "He should, but he's grown more passive, or rather, he's easily swayed by those around him. And Tywin's wealth is formidable. The crown is in debt to House Lannister." Catelyn approached Gendry, her gaze softening. This is not your burden, Gendry, though I know you care. The realm is in turmoil, and you've found yourself caught in its midst. Gendry nodded, wondering if he could do anything besides stand by. Ned dismissed him kindly, saying they needed to speak in private. As Gendry left, he heard Robb voicing frustration at the constraints placed on them. The memory of the Lannister men creeping into Winterfell's library haunted Gendry anew. If war broke out, the Lannisters might do anything to secure their hold on the throne, including eliminating threats like Robert's bastard. Over the next few days, tensions only escalated. Lannister guards swaggered through the Red Keep as if it belonged to them. Whispers circulated that Jaime Lannister had confronted Ned in the throne room, exchanging cold words. Some said a fight nearly erupted then and there. The king, when Gendry glimpsed him, seemed half lost in his cups, as though trying to drown out the approaching storm with wine and laughter. The queen's face was like a mask, serene yet watchful. One evening, as Gendry made his way through the keep, a guard motioned for him to halt. He wore the Baratheon stag sigil, not Lannister crimson. "The king wants a word with you," the guard said brusquely, flicking his gaze up and down Gendry's figure. Alarm jolted through him. "Me? Are you sure?" The guard nodded, gesturing for Gendry to follow. They descended a winding staircase into a lower level of the keep, then emerged in a hallway near a private audience chamber. A pair of Kingsguards stood at the door, letting Gendry and the guard pass upon seeing the stag sigil. Inside, the room was lit by a single candle and a small hearth, shadows dancing on the walls. The guard stepped back, leaving Gendry alone. The door shut. Across the chamber, Robert Baratheon stood, one hand resting on a table laden with wine jugs. "So," the king said, his voice low and thick with drink, "we finally speak." He turned, and Gendry saw the weight of years etched in the king's face, far different from the boisterous man who had once claimed him in the Red Keep months ago. The king's eyes were bloodshot, his beard flecked with gray, yet the broadness of his shoulders remained a reminder of the warrior he once was. Gendry bowed, swallowing hard. "Your Grace." Robert studied him, silence stretching. "Ned's told me how you fared in Winterfell," he said at last. "Said your training with a sword, forging steel, growing stronger." His tone was half pondering, as if he were trying to reconcile two images, the bastard in Flea Bottom and the ward of House Stark. Gendry stood rigid. "Lord Stark has been generous. He's taught me much. Ned's always been too good for this world," Robert said, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand. "Gods, you look so much like me when I W." Gendry stiffened at the word, though he'd heard it plenty. "I'm grateful you entrusted me to Lord Stark," he said carefully, uncertain how to handle the king's drunken candor. Robert walked closer, an unsteady step. The smell of wine clung to him. "Are you? Maybe you'd have been better off never being found. Life in Flea Bottom is a pit, but it's out of this viper's nest. I've done you no favors bringing you to court." Gendry hesitated, unsure if he was meant to answer. Robert's eyes flicked up. "You know the realm's on the brink of war, don't you? My dear wife's father and brother are making moves that threaten everything." He gave a short, hollow laugh. "It seems the throne is not as secure as I once thought." Gendry dared a question. "Then can't you stop them, Your Grace?" "Stop them?" Robert echoed with a sneer. "I should have put Tywin in his place years ago, but he was always too useful. Now he's grown monstrous with pride. And my own council is riddled with schemers, Baelish, Varys, even Renly and Pycelle. They all want something. And my son." He paused, face twisting at the mention of Joffrey. "I suppose that's how it goes, boy. Power devours itself." Silence fell. The fire crackled in the hearth. Gendry felt cold sweat on his palms. The king's words carried despair, a far cry from the triumphant warrior Gendry had once imagined. Robert studied him again. "You're a strong lad. Ned says you have skill with a hammer, a sword, and more. A true Baratheon if ever there was one. I wish—" He let the sentence fade, his expression a curious blend of regret and resignation. Suddenly he huffed. "You'll stay close to Ned. He's the only man in this city I trust without question. Keep out of the Queen's sight, and if Joffrey or any Lannister dogs provoke you, hold your tongue. Or do you want to get yourself killed? I'll be careful, Gendry said, voice low. I won't cause trouble. Good, Robert muttered. That's all then. Go on. The king turned away, refilling his goblet with wine. He didn't dismiss Gendry with a formal wave, just stood there, posture slumped. Gendry hesitated a moment longer, then bowed and left, the guard outside falling in to escort him back. A swirl of emotions roiled in Gendry's chest. That conversation with the king was the closest he'd ever come to an acknowledgement of his heritage. Yet it felt hollow, overshadowed by Robert's bitterness and the looming threat of war. He felt no triumph, only a strange ache. He sought out Ned that night, finding him alone in the solar. Ned sat by a table, reading a letter with weary eyes. Gendry knocked softly and entered at Ned's beckon. "My lord," he said, "I just came from the king." Ned looked up sharply, alarm flashing across his features. "Robert summoned you? What did he say?" Gendry recounted the conversation as best he could. At the mention of Robert's gloom, Ned sighed, pressing his hand to his brow. "He's been drinking too much. The burden of the throne weighs heavy. Still, I'm sorry you had to face that alone." Gendry shook his head. "He told me to stay close to you, that you'd keep me safe." He hesitated. "Is that true, my lord? With war looming, can anyone really be safe?" Ned's eyes reflected a fatherly concern. "I'll do all within my power to protect you, Gendry. You're part of my household and my friend's son. War may come, but I won't abandon you." Moved by the sincerity, Gendry dipped his head. "Thank you." He turned to go, but Ned's voice stopped him. "If things worsen," Ned said quietly, "and the city becomes too dangerous, I may send you north again with some trusted men. Understand that it's not an act of cowardice, but of preservation. Your life is not a pawn in their game." Gendry left with those words echoing in his mind. Over the next week, tensions ratcheted higher. News arrived that Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, was raiding the Riverlands, leading to calls for justice. Ned, outraged, demanded that the king address it. Robert did so half-heartedly, naming Ned as the one to punish Gregor. The queen bristled at that, but Robert overruled her. As Ned began summoning men to hunt down Gregor, the entire court seemed to teeter on the brink of an explosion. Late one night, Gendry was awakened by frantic knocking at his chamber door. He threw it open to find Theon, eyes wide. "They've attacked your group in the yard," Theon gasped. "Lannister men. Hurry!" Heart pounding, Gendry grabbed his sword, following Theon at a run through torchlit corridors. They emerged into a courtyard near the stables, where a chaotic scuffle was underway. Stark guards clashed with Lannister soldiers, steel flashing in the torchlight. Shouts rang off the red stone walls. Gendry spotted one of the guards who often trained him pinned against a wall, fending off a Lannister halberd with a bent shield. Drawing his sword, Gendry flung himself into the fray, fear and adrenaline coursing through him. He parried a blow from a Lannister soldier, stepping inside the man's guard and knocking him off balance with sheer strength. The man staggered, and Gendry followed up with a punch to the helmet. The clang reverberated in his own arm. Another soldier lunged with a spear. Gendry rolled aside, the spear tip scraping the ground. He swung low, slicing the man's calf, causing him to crumple with a howl. The courtyard was a swirl of violence. Theon joined in, brandishing an axe, cursing in the iron-born tongue. Robb appeared from another corridor, shouting orders to the Stark men to rally. The Lannister soldiers, outnumbered, began to retreat. Gendry realized these were likely the Queen's men or those loyal to Jaime, acting on some midnight provocation. Once they saw Robb leading more reinforcements, they fled, leaving several of their wounded behind. Breathing hard, Gendry stooped to check on the downed Stark guard. The man groaned, a deep cut across his ribs, but he was alive. Around them, the courtyard reeked of blood and fear. Robb barked for the men to form a perimeter. Theon wiped his brow, chest heaving. "What was that about?" he muttered. "They stormed in, demanded some nonsense about us consorting with traitors." Gendry's hands shook around his sword hilt. This was no drunken brawl. Something had triggered the Lannisters to attack. They all looked up as Ned arrived, flanked by more Stark guards. Ned's face was set in hard lines as he surveyed the wounded. "Find out who gave the order for this," he snapped. "We'll have answers. Bring any wounded Lannisters to the hall for questioning." A swirl of orders followed. Gendry helped carry the wounded Stark guard, passing him into the care of a maester's assistant. By the time the courtyard settled, it was nearly dawn. Gendry, exhausted, found himself pacing in the stable, the smell of hay mixing with the sharp tang of blood. Robb and Theon joined him there. "What do you think set them off?" Gendry asked, voice hoarse. Robb shook his head. "Father believes they wanted an excuse to show force, to provoke us. They might be testing the king's reaction or sending a message." He raked a hand through his auburn hair. "If it's open war they want, they're close to sparking it." Theon's mouth twisted. "If the king does nothing, we'll know who truly holds power in King's Landing." Gendry heard footsteps on the straw-strewn floor. He turned to see Arya standing in the stable entrance, half-dressed, hair tousled. She stared wide-eyed at the scene, the battered men, the tense faces. "Is it war?" she asked quietly. None of them had a reassuring answer to give. Robb only said, "We'll see what father does." That day, Ned confronted the king. Word went out that Robert was furious at the disturbance, but also furious at Ned for pressing the issue of Gregor Clegane's raids. Rumors flew that Robert had thrown a goblet against the wall, cursing both the Starks and the Lannisters. The tension in the keep was palpable. Guards eyed each other in corridors. Courtiers whispered about lines being drawn. Gendry sensed it was only a matter of time before a spark ignited the powder keg. A few days later, an event arrived that changed everything. King Robert, in his infinite stubbornness, went on a boar hunt with a small retinue. Most said he was too drunk to hold a spear properly, but he insisted on going anyway, ignoring Ned's counsel. Days passed, and then news returned. Robert had been gored by the boar, grievously wounded. The city reeled in shock. The king was carried back to the Red Keep, pale and bleeding, a hush falling over the castle as the royal physicians struggled to save him. Ned vanished into Robert's chambers. The queen barred the doors, letting only certain individuals inside. Rumors spread that Robert was on his deathbed, that he'd named someone as regent, that the Lannisters were pressing for the throne to pass swiftly to Joffrey. Gendry's heart pounded with fear. If Robert died, what would become of him? The Lannisters would have no reason to let him live, if they considered him a threat to Joffrey's claim. On the third day, Gendry and the rest of the Stark household waited anxiously in their chambers for word. Late that night, Theon stormed in, face grim, leading Gendry and Robb aside. "Robert's dead," he said quietly, each word heavy. "Ned has the king's final decree naming him protector of the realm, but the Lannisters have seized the throne room. Joffrey's declared himself king." Robb's expression hardened. "Father won't stand for that. Joffrey's no rightful heir. Father knows the truth." Gendry's knees nearly buckled. Robert dead, the father he barely knew gone, and the Lannisters seizing power in a likely coup. He pressed a hand to the hilt of his sword, mind racing. Theon continued, voice urgent. "We need to act quickly, or they'll arrest us all. Some say they're already hunting for Ned's allies. If we stay, we might be taken hostage or killed." At that moment, a thunder of boots sounded in the corridor. The door burst open, revealing Lannister guards in red cloaks, swords drawn. One of them barked, "Lay down your arms. By order of King Joffrey, you are under arrest for treason." Chaos erupted. Robb drew his sword. Theon swung his axe. Gendry braced himself. The guards surged in. Steel clashed, sparks flying. Despite their training, the three of them were outnumbered. Robb shouted for them to fight free. Gendry lunged, knocking one guard's blade aside. then slammed him with his shoulder. Another guard seized Theon from behind, trying to wrestle the axe away. A blow to Theon's gut made him stagger. Robb was pinned by two foes, barely fending them off. In the swirl, Gendry managed to slip behind a guard and smash the pommel of his sword into the back of the man's helmet. The guard dropped, momentarily stunned. Gendry helped Robb break free, grabbing the older boy's arm. Theon, battered but furious, shoved one guard aside and wrenched himself out of the corridor, stumbling after them. They sprinted through the hallway, hearing shouts of alarm behind them. Down the corridors they fled, each turn revealing more Lannister men. "We've got to get Arya and Sansa," Robb shouted. "We can't leave them." But the path to the royal apartments was blocked by more red-cloaked soldiers. They glimpsed a swirl of movement, heard Sansa scream in the distance, but could not fight their way to her. A loud horn blast echoed. All around, the Red Keep was erupting with violence. Stark men fought valiantly, but the Lannisters had the advantage of surprise and numbers. Gendry's mind reeled. If they did not escape, they would be cornered. But leaving the Starks behind felt like betrayal. Robb's face was ashen with indecision. Then, rounding a corner, they nearly collided with Ser Roderick Castle, who was bleeding from a wound on his arm, but still upright. "Robb!" the Master-at-Arms cried. "They have your father. He's to be taken to the throne room. We must rally our men or flee. We cannot stand in open battle here." Robb's knuckles whitened around his sword. "We can't leave, father. We can't leave my sisters." Castle's expression was anguished. "There's no path to them, my lord. We must survive. We'll gather allies and free them. But not here, not now." The sound of approaching Lannister boots thundered. Castle motioned for them to follow. A small group of Stark guards joined, forming a wedge. They fought their way through lesser passages, blood spattering the walls. Twice Gendry nearly fell, parrying savage strikes. Theon was wounded in the shoulder, cursing with every step. Robb pressed on, eyes blazing with desperation. At last, they reached a sally port that led into the city. The locked gate was forced open by Castle, and the group spilled out into an alley beneath the keep's outer wall. Night cloaked them. Shouts and torchlight glimmered above on the ramparts. "Hurry!" Castle hissed. "We must vanish into the city." Gendry's heart hammered. They had lost Ned. They had no idea where Arya or Sansa were. The Red Keep was in Lannister hands, and Joffrey sat the throne. The battered survivors, no more than a dozen men, fled through the winding streets, searching for safety in a city that had become their enemy. After hours of skulking through dark alleys, they finally reached a warehouse near the mud gate controlled by a loyal bannerman. There they collapsed, licking wounds and mourning the day's disaster. Robb sat, head in his hands, Theon wincing as a guard bound his shoulder. Gendry leaned against the damp wall, numb, sword still clutched in his hand. "What now?" Gendry whispered. Robb raised his head, tears in his eyes. "We free my father. We find my sisters. We call the banners of the north if we must. But we'll not bend to these lions." Castle grunted in agreement, though his face was bleak. "Aye, my lord, we must plan carefully. For now, we rest and gather our strength." Gendry looked around at the grim faces. He understood then that the forging of alliances had reached its breaking point. War had come. Whatever illusions of safety he'd once had were gone. He was no longer just a ward. He was a fugitive, hunted by the new king, a bastard with royal blood, standing beside the heir of Winterfell, who vowed to free his father from Lannister chains. Their next steps would determine their fates and possibly the fate of the entire realm. The old Gendry, the blacksmith's apprentice, might have cowered. But this Gendry, forged by Ned Stark's guidance and the northern sense of honor, lifted his head. He would not abandon them. Whether King's Landing stood or fell, whether the Lannisters discovered his parentage or not, he would fight. The clang of steel and the hammering of destiny echoed in his mind, urging him onward. At dawn, they began to plan their next move, as the city roiled in the aftermath of King Robert's death. Soldiers scoured the streets for any Stark men who hadn't been killed or arrested. The crows circled overhead. A hush of fear settled on King's Landing. Yet in the warehouse by the mud gate, Gendry and Robb and the last loyal men lit a small brazier and swore they would not abandon Ned Stark or the North. The forging had reached its hottest flame, and there would be no turning back, no surrender. So began Gendry's involvement in a conflict that would shape the fate of Westeros. Where once he had only dreamed of forging swords, he now found himself forging alliances and forging himself anew in the crucible of war. With every breath, he felt that truth. He was no longer just a boy carrying secret royal blood, but a young man fighting alongside the wolves, determined to see the dawn of a better day, if the realm itself did not burn first.